Despite gains toward the WPS agenda, the reality is that peace and security architecture is very much founded on these hyper-masculine security institutions.
Welcome, Gretchen.
Thanks, Steph.
At SIPRI, as part of the Peace Operations and Conflict Management team, you're working on really interesting topics: the peacekeeping situation, masculinities, and of course the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And October is a very important month for the Women, Peace and Security agenda at the United Nations. And it would be really interesting to hear from you today. The agenda is currently facing challenges, and among others, some criticism of becoming overly securitized. Can you explain that to us?
So first, I think particularly within the Security Council at the UN, we're seeing these really serious increasing geopolitical tensions, which are kind of stagnating a lot of forward motion in the Security Council and sort of progressive policy gains. In particular, where the Women, Peace and Security agenda is concerned, and sort of gender more broadly, we're also seeing increased backlash against women's rights. We're seeing rising right-wing populist movements. We're also seeing increasing misinformation and disinformation around gender, which is quite serious. And all of these sort of trends are taking place kind of all over the world, including in countries that have traditionally been champions for the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So this is really, it's not only stagnating progress on implementation of the agenda, but it's actually putting the agenda at risk. We see in spaces where normative language, like language about the WPS agenda, in spaces where that kind of normative language is negotiated, there's quite a lot more pushback now. This sort of previously accepted language that for years has been thought of as protected, as set in stone perhaps as Security Council language can be, but where we used to see that previously agreed language, there's now quite a bit of backtracking on that, right? And quite a number of states that are pushing back against sexual and health and reproductive rights, for example. So that's one significant challenge. And then the second, as you mentioned, is the securitization of the agenda and the securitization of gender. And when we talk about securitization, what this refers to is political issues and identities being framed as threats, to often existential threats to some sort of status quo. And these threats are then in turn framed as requiring a military or a sort of a securitized response. Sometimes gender identity itself is securitized, right, is the thing that's framed as a threat. But more often what we see is a sort of framing of threats against gender equality, threats against women's rights, being framed as the securitized threat. So Azadeh Movani, who's a journalist who's worked on gender issues for many, many years, wrote a couple of years ago, and I'm paraphrasing, but war making has in recent years become increasingly sort of driven by gender equality, fights for gender equality. And what that means, I think that's a really great condensed way to talk about how gender equality and women's rights are being securitized, in that they're being used as a justification for military response, for weaponization, for mass surveillance, repression of protest movements. We're seeing all of these really kind of negative trends play out in the name of gender equality, in the name of progress, in the name of women's rights. To say nothing of, the securitization of gender identity itself, which plays out a great deal in the mis and disinformation trends that I mentioned earlier.
And that's obviously a worrying trend. And what do you think is causing this trend?
A number of things. I mean, I think particularly when we think about peace operations and conflict management, and when we think about the broader peace and security architecture globally, I think despite gains toward the WPS agenda, the reality is that peace and security architecture is very much founded on these hyper-masculine security institutions, right? It's an innately militarized structure. And so even though the WPS agenda at its core is meant to be a transformative agenda, it has deeply anti-militarist roots. It's meant to be a sort of tool by which positive peace can be achieved. The reality is that the agenda is it's held within this hyper masculine, hyper militarized structure. And so as we see increasing conflict globally, increasing violence, one thing that has shifted for the agenda is that the Women, Peace and Security agenda is structured as 4 key pillars. And those pillars are participation, prevention, protection, and relief and recovery. And the idea is that they should all operate together, right? Implementation should include every single one of those pillars consistently. They should not be siloed. They are extremely cross-cutting, and they all sort of depend on one another. But the trend that we've seen is that participation is sort of prioritized above the other 3. And the way that plays out in an increasingly securitized context is that pushes for implementation of the WPS agenda become sort of reduced to a push for women's representation in security institutions, which from a rights-based perspective is important. Women have the fundamental right to participate in any institutions that they want. But when that sort of becomes the stand-in for the entirety of the agenda,
it's too limited?
It's too limited, exactly. And you know, it doesn't only take place in security institutions, of course, but even, you know, maybe an example of how interlinked these pillars are is in peace operations, for example. If you do a concerted push to increase women's representation by the numbers, you push for gender parity, right? In peace operations, in these institutions which are at their core not built for women to be participants, then if you don't consider, for example, the protection pillar of the agenda, and you don't consider the fact that the WPS agenda also calls for women's protection from gender-based violence, for example, it calls for the institutionalization and advocacy of women's rights, then you get women just sort of dropped into these institutions that are hyper-masculine, they're hyper-militarized, and it's so basic, but at times they don't have women's toilets. You know, they don't have separate ablutions facilities. And this is a huge, you know, people are working on this. There's a huge push for this now, but that's sort of, these pillars have to all be taken together. And this is to say nothing, of course, of the much more sort of local level, sort of everyday civilians who are affected by war in very gendered ways.
But would you think that then this is an easy way out, just to tick the box? Now we have increased the women participation, everything is fine?
It can be an easy way to say we're making progress toward the Women, Peace and Security agenda's implementation. It can be an easy way to say, there are women at the table, right? Oh, we have women present, we're able to photograph women, we're able to publish photographs of women participating. You know, I think it requires a lot less serious sort of reflexivity on the parts of both individuals and institutions more broadly on what sort of the very gendered nature of those institutions is. I think a truly progressive push toward implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda requires reflecting on the innate gender biases that the entire world is built on. That's from all the way from the individual level to the institutional level. And the WPS agenda calls for this, right? Seeing the gender differences in how different people experience war, in different protection concerns, the ways that Different people experience state-led security interventions, the ways that different people are or are not targeted by states or non-state armed groups.
On all you say, if we look at how this is playing out in the field, and from your perspective in a concrete conflict management setting, how would a great integration of the principles of this agenda look like?
The number one thing that I would love to see is really to have that gender perspective brought in very, very early. And I think the other thing, and we've looked at this a bit in SIPRI research, there's a sort of understandable tension between what we refer to as inside the fence and outside the fence. So inside the fence referring to internal policies, think about a peace operations base, right? I mean, literally inside of the fence of that base, versus outside the fence, which refers to, things like host community engagement, civil society consultations. This is where I would bring in a gendered analysis of conflict dynamics and social dynamics and the deep, deep need for contextual understanding of different, social coherence broadly, and that's of course not gender, but I think given the strength of the WPS agenda, gender is a really important and accessible entry point for doing that. And so having at least contextual gender analysis brought in early just does a great deal for sort of how peace operations understand the environment within which they're operating and can better ensure that their operational level activities are benefiting the people who need it most, right, which is the host community, which is the civilian population. This is, of course, also very mission dependent and mandate dependent. So if we talk about the UN context, large multilateral missions have a lot more that they can do on gender. Smaller, like EU observational or training missions, for example, UN observation missions, it can be more complicated to determine sort of how relevant the WPS agenda feels to those missions. And I think that's another reason that participation is very often sort of held as this number one sort of standard for the WPS agenda, is that no matter what the mandate is, you can always say, well, there should be women in the mission. And that's fine, but again, I think it can really preclude the more complex thinking on how we even understand the context within which these missions are operating. So.
I take it that there's still also a lot which needs to be happening in people's minds on all levels involved, but let's keep an eye on October. And thank you for talking to us today.
Thank you, Steph.